I'm going to be talking about free trade agreements a lot and what I have to say. So if I say FTA, you'll understand that that's free trade agreement, not fun, travel, and adventure. Jennifer, before I start, Jennifer was talking about the TPP as being the biggest FTA. It covers, at this point, 40% of the world's economy. That's how big it is. Okay, the Trans-Pacific Partnership is the latest in this series of free trade agreements that have come into existence since the late 1980s. The first of these, the US-Canada Free Trade Agreement in 1988, was quickly followed by NAFTA in 1991, and now there are over, somebody tell me if I'm talking too loudly, because I have no idea.
That's good.
Okay, somebody tell me. Okay, quickly followed by NAFTA in 1991, and now there are more than a dozen multilateral free trade agreements and over 3,000 bilateral FTAs and investment treaties. So we have a lot of historical experience to draw on in terms of analyzing this document that we've only seen a few pieces of that have been leaked. It's important to understand that most of these agreements, as Adam was saying, have very little to do with trade, but they have everything to do with economic and political dominance. A quick history lesson. At the end of World War II, the United States and a group of other rich nations created three important international institutions: the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, commonly called GATT. The purpose of these institutions was to manage the world's economy, which they have done ever since the end of World War II, and they've operated very much to the advantage of the rich countries. The IMF and the World Bank lend money, capital, to poor countries, supposedly to help them develop, i.e. industrialize. If these countries can't pay the money back, as often happens, the IMF and World Bank may impose certain conditions or structural adjustments. For example, the debtor nation will be forced to slash public services, privatize major national industries, and allow foreign corporations to exploit its natural resources. Think of what's going on in Greece right now. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was the third institution created then. In 1995, the GATT was restructured as the World Trade Organization, and it took its place alongside the IMF and the World Bank as the manager and arbiter of global financial power by facilitating a series of free trade agreements. Here, I'd like to introduce a word that is in common use in the international sphere, but not frequently heard within the United States. That word is neoliberalism. It has nothing to do with liberalism, the social and political liberalism that we're familiar with. It is not at all about liberating people, it's about liberating financial capital. Under neoliberalism, profit becomes the arbiter of all questions, whether they're questions about finance and trade or human rights and the environment. Neoliberalism aspires to, and does, deregulate industry, privatize schools, hospitals, utilities, public transportation, and anything else that's run in the people's interest. Shreds the social safety net, smashing organized labor. In international relations, one of the main ways neoliberalism manifests itself is in free trade agreements. That's what we're seeing now with the TPP. Neoliberalism has been embraced by every US president from Reagan on, and it's now the dominant economic philosophy in the world. TPP did not come out of nowhere. Free trade agreements make it easier for companies to move their operations to countries with cheaper labor. And then this flight of jobs overseas puts downward pressure on the wages and conditions of the jobs that remain in the home country. NAFTA resulted in the loss of at least 700,000 jobs in the US. It also facilitated the exportation of cheap US corn into Mexico, which resulted in the bankruptcy of over 1 million Mexican farmers. And NAFTA is not unique. The same economics are at work in every free trade agreement that facilitates offshoring jobs, like, for instance, the TPP. One aspect of the TPP has gotten very little attention, and please pay attention to this: the deregulation of financial institutions, financial markets. Even a limited and inadequate law like Dodd-Frank could be thrown out if it is deemed an unfair barrier to the future income of financial speculators. Think of the chaos that resulted from the meltdown in 2007 and 2008, and then think of that being institutionalized in an international agreement. We've already learned about how free trade agreements can supersede national and local laws, and this is clearly a direct assault on democracy. But it's not the only assault on democracy that's associated with free trade. Let me elaborate. Free trade agreements vastly increase income inequality, and study after study shows the greater the income inequality in the country, the less functional its democracy is. These various studies have all the charts and graphs and statistics to back them up, but basically they say what we already know: power follows money. The Center for Economic and Policy Research examined the effect free trade had on income distribution. They looked at the United States from 1990 to 2007, a period that covers the early years of the US-Canada Free Trade Agreement and NAFTA. Then they isolated income directly affected by free trade. And here's what they found. Free trade negatively impacted everybody's income except for the top 5%. Their income went up dramatically as a result of free trade. Ergo, more free trade equals more income inequality equals less democracy. Access to information is the lifeblood of democracy. The free trade, the Trans-Pacific Partnership will seriously restrict our access to information. As Jennifer was talking about, patents are going to be extended. Copyright laws are going to be tightened. There will be no distinction under the TPP between individuals who infringe on copyright for their own use, think photocopying a page from a book or making a disc of your favorite songs. No distinction between those individuals who infringe on copyrights and corporations who infringe on copyrights or throw out copyrights for profit. Internet intermediaries, Facebook, Twitter, the folks who facilitate your email or website, would be liable if any of their users violate copyright laws. Every day, there are 58 million tweets. Over 600 million users use Facebook, and some 300 billion emails are sent. Think of the enormous bureaucracy and cost and the impact involved in all the internet, if all the internet intermediaries have to monitor every communication they handle.
Fast track is actually a Nixon-era trade agreement, so Richard Nixon created it. It negotiates the approval process that hands much of Congress's constitutional authority and real-world leverage to influence the terms of trade agreements over to the executive branch. So, you know, he didn't want Congress to tell him, you know, what trade agreements or what laws he could actually approve. So he made up fast track. Under Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution, Congress possesses, you know, the exclusive authority to regulate commerce between nations. But fast track actually moves that authority, the power to select trading partners, the power to set the terms of trade agreements and sign them before Congress votes on them, the power to write implementing legislation that changes wide swaths of existing U.S. law, and then it circumvents the ordinary committee review process, and it submits the legislation directly to Congress for a mandatory expedited vote without going through committees. So what that means for us in reality is there's really very few places where we can stop it once it's happened. Because, you know, normally it goes to committee and you can, you know, pressure the committee chairs and the committee members and et cetera. So it skips all of that. So suddenly you're dealing with all of the members of Congress. And it also gives the executive branch, the president, the authority to override congressional leaders' control of the House and Senate floor schedules. So even if you know, geared up and had an army of people ready to get in touch with every single Congress member on this day, the president could just stop it and make it another day. So it's pretty, and the president can override normal voting procedures. And then he in this case, can ban all amendments and limits on debate time. Fast track actually expired in 2007. Congress would need to pass new legislation so that for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, so that's our moment in time to stop this. And they had wanted to do it in October, and I think that that's probably not really on schedule given some of the events of today, but you know, we should be ready for October, November, the fast track to actually be voted on again.
Traditionally, the role of government under capitalism is, one of their main roles is to keep various parts of the economy from destroying themselves because of their need for profit. Under neoliberalism, largely the state, the government, has abandoned that role, and they've said, let's look at the short term. The short term is long enough for us, and we'll let it go. And the distinction between the government and the corporations is kind of like at the revolving door of, you know, Congress and K Street and the corporation and the corporate boards, kind of like the modern KKK. And it's all of one piece in a lot of ways. The one thing that the state is not abandoning, the government is not abandoning, is the role of the military, which is more and more taking over its function. And it's to keep things in line, to protect, as I was saying, there's the direct relationship and the integral relationship between the military and the trade agreements. One of the things that the two economic historians that I cited, Gallagher and Robinson, one of the things they say is people usually think of free trade as control of trade without control, and in fact they say they should say it's trade where they don't need to control if possible, but they will bring in the military if necessary. So that's that. Ollie was asking about the Malaysia tobacco exclusion. And what I thought about was Australia, which had been sued by, I believe, an American tobacco company under an old trade law. Australia had a law that said that cigarettes had to be in plain packages, plain paper packages, no advertising on it, so no Joe Camel or whatever. And they were sued by an American tobacco company and they won. And the previous government in Australia had been resisting the part of the TPP that would allow corporations to sue the government, and the current much more conservative government in Australia is saying, we're not so hard, we know that's not such a bad thing, that's okay with us.
It was an excellent point about Malaysia. The pushback on the TPP has been much better from some of the developing or middle-income countries that are going to be a partner to the trade agreement, and that's where we've gotten, the leaked texts from. That's where we've gotten some real victories from, and in the history of free trade agreements, that's where we've gotten some of the worst language out. But it should just be pointed out that there's a tremendous amount of work that we could do, and we could stop forcing, countries like Malaysia and Vietnam to have to do our work and get rid of our government's trade agreements that will punish them. And also, at best, we've had victories in getting some language out, but the overall framework still exists, and so it's really our job to try to get rid of the overall framework, since it's our government.
Yeah, the gentleman mentioned the idea of writing an op-ed concerning the tobacco issues around TPP. Someone actually had that idea. His name was Michael Bloomberg. He ran an op-ed in the New York Times, which answers the question, how bad does a free trade agreement have to be for Mike Bloomberg to be against it? Well, here's your answer. What particularly prompted him to do that was right before, or at the opening of the last round of TPP negotiations, the U.S. announced that long-standing promises that it had made to the anti-tobacco movement in the U.S. around a tobacco carve-out in TPP, they're basically going to break that promise, and we're going to have a dramatically watered-down version of what they've been promising all along. The anti-tobacco groups have been waiting for this language to be introduced around the tobacco carve-out, and finally the Obama administration just made it clear that it was going to sell them out because it was getting pressure from the tobacco industry and from tobacco farmers. So, with regard to bringing attention to this issue, Philip Morris has an office on 42nd Street and Park Avenue. It is conveniently located walking distance from Pfizer's corporate office, which is conveniently located walking distance from Novartis's corporate office, two of the worst corporations in terms of what Jennifer's been telling us about, in terms of killing people by limiting access to essential medicines. So if we want to take action about how TPP is destroying people's health, this would make a nice, convenient march that we could have one of these days pretty soon to help draw attention to these issues.
Thank you. Novartis and Pfizer are actually really driving the access to medicines part. Novartis is very mad about a court case that they lost in India.
Okay, so quickly, the Atlantic Trade Agreement, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which the people negotiating are calling TTIP, and people on our side tend to call TAFTA, the Transatlantic Free Trade Agreement, since it reminds people of NAFTA. One of the reasons we haven't heard as much about it is it's much newer. TPP is nearing the end of its negotiations. TAFTA has really just started negotiations. It would be a free trade agreement between the US and the entire European Union. There's this negotiations now going on between Canada and Europe also, so it's very possible that we may be looking at those negotiations being potentially down the line rolled together. It's a trade agreement. It's huge. It's a trade agreement between the U.S. and a 500 million person region. It's everything we've seen about it so far suggests that it's everything bad about TPP reflected. In the case of Europe, we're looking at, in a lot of cases, Europe having higher standards than the U.S. in a lot of areas. So the U.S. aggressively working to bring Europe down to U.S. standards in terms of things like food safety standards, rather than doing the same thing and bringing us up to their standards. It's bad news, and we have a little more time on it, but The fight on fast track is a fight about TPP and TAFTA, because the fast track that's going to be passed will cover both of those trade agreements. So if fast track falls, if President Obama can't get fast track, he's going to have a lot of trouble continuing TAFTA negotiations, because it pretty much says to Europe that he's negotiating without the authority to negotiate. The president is not just not supposed to, without fast track, without fast track, the president shouldn't even be negotiating trade agreements. It's not just that fast track isn't just about regulating how Congress decides trade agreements. It's what's giving the president the power to negotiate these in the first place. So if President Obama can't, and he's been negotiating TPP as if he already had fast track, even though he didn't. So if fast track falls apart, TAFTA is going to be in very big trouble. With regard to the China question, a lot of TPP is about China. China is not in TPP, but an important thing to understand about TPP, a phrase that's used a lot about TPP, is that it is a docking agreement. And what they mean by that is that once TPP is passed, they can bring other countries into TPP. And countries that have been talked about include India, Bangladesh, Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia, Colombia, and China. Well, that's interesting because, first of all, it's terrifying, but every time we've passed a trade agreement in the past, we've had Congress has had the ability to vote on whether we should have a trade agreement with that country. So, for example, when the US was in negotiations for a trade agreement with Colombia, part of the issue was not just, what's the particular language of this trade agreement, but is this a country we should be in a trade agreement with? Does it make sense to have a trade agreement with a country where something like 3,000 union organizers have been assassinated since the 1980s? With a country with the worst human rights record in the Western Hemisphere? With a country that I think now has been beaten by Syria, but had the highest rate of internal displacement of any country in the world, higher than the Sudan. So it matters what countries we're in trade agreements with, but after TPP passes, other countries can just be added and we won't be able to do a thing about it. So I want to pass that.
Do either one of the panelists want to briefly say something?
Oh, yeah, sure. So just to add something about TTIP, there's two areas of, one thing is that to me, TTIP is actually it's a more level playing field where, the TPP is actually the United States, for the most part, negotiating with partners that are much weaker and rely on us in terms of economic assistance. So the ability for countries to stand up, it's a much higher bar and say no to certain parts of the agreement or to say no to the agreement overall. Basically we're strong-arming developing countries into joining our trade agreement. So at least with the TTIP, we've got this level playing field. So Adam mentioned that countries in Europe have a higher bar for certain areas. Two areas that just people should know about is genetically modified foods. So, Europe's a little bit better about telling their citizenry whether or not their food are GMOs. And then the other area is financial regulation. So like 11 countries in the Eurozone have just agreed to pass a Robin Hood tax, and one of the functions of a Robin Hood tax or financial transaction tax is that it's actually a form of regulation. It slows down fast, high-frequency trading. So if they were to go into this agreement, that could be deemed illegal, or if they agree to the provisions of this. The other thing is a big demand is that in the TTIP, there's a focus on IP protections. So again, intellectual property rights, and again, that can mean around access to medicines. And so there's a big demand to take that out. And then I just wanted to highlight everybody, there's this DeLauro letter, a Miller-DeLauro letter to Congress. Take it to your Congress members. And then I also just want to say that if India joins the TPP, they produce 80% of the world's access to medicines, and they will no longer be able to export them. It will literally, right now we have UNAID statistics are coming out tomorrow, and the leaked text from them says that over 9 million people have access to treatment. About 7 million will lose access to treatment if India can't export medications. Also, the TPP targets countries like Malaysia and Vietnam that have these a new focus on industry of producing generic medications. So we're already tamping down the generic production in those two countries, and if India joins the TPP, you know, it literally, I mean, this isn't rhetoric. Literally, people will die. You know, at least 7 million people will die in the next 3 years that will lose access to medications. So that's pretty enormous.
On the question of the Asia pivot, I'm sorry if I was not clear on what I was saying. Yes, the Asia pivot is very definitely aimed at China and secondarily Russia to isolate them. A lot of the Asia pivot, this is not a forum about the Asia pivot, but I think that, as I was saying, the TPP absolutely fits in with that, and as I was saying, is the economic arm of the Asia pivot. The Asia pivot has a lot to do with control of resources, particularly fossil fuels, deep water drilling in the South Pacific, and the South China Sea is a major shipping route for petroleum, and control of that is a major factor in geopolitics.